War and Peace by Leo Tolstoy, book review. So this is part of my scripted book review series in which I reread an old book review that I wrote on the blog years ago and try and make it into a YouTube video for whatever that may or may not be worth. Advance warning, I'm going to do a lot of rambling on this one. I'm going to talk about all my history with this book, why I wanted to read it, why I was intimidated by it, and it's going to be one of my usual long, rambly videos. If you don't have the patience to sit through that, I'm going to give you the takeaway right here at the beginning. Takeaway is, I was intimidated by this book for years. I finally got around to reading it, and it was such a pleasure to read. I needn't have been intimidated by it for all those years. It's just very interesting, easy to read, pleasure to read. It's if you, like me, have been intimidated by this book, just give it a try. Go out there, get a copy out of your library, start in the first few pages. I think you'll enjoy it. Okay. Now to get into all my history with this book. Yeah, so I suspect a lot of people are like me, meaning that they've been meaning to read this book forever, but are intimidated by it. I mean, I think people come into three categories, right? There's people who aren't readers, and they're not going to touch it. And there's people who are voracious readers, like, you know, Steve Donahue over at Steve Reads or something, and he'd read it in an afternoon and not think twice about it. But then there's people like me, people who have ambitions to be readers, ambitions to be literary, but often struggle to get through the classics and are intimidated by them, which is one of the reasons I kept putting this book off for a long time. At the same time, I was very curious about this book, and I was curious about it because it seemed to overlap with a number of interests I had. You know, I've always been fascinated by big epic stories about war and societal changes and stuff like that, so I wanted to see what this big epic story was all about. Of course, this book has quite a reputation as being like one of the greatest works of literature of all time. So that's enough to make a person curious, huh? I wanted to know what was in it that made this book so great. In addition, by the time I started getting into college age and interested in history and politics, and specifically radical politics, I discovered there were a lot of connections between radical politics and this book, or at least there appeared to be. Leo Tolstoy himself, near the end of his life, adapted sort of an anarchist, Christian, pacifist philosophy. He had a famous correspondence with Mahatma Gandhi in India. So that was something that piqued my interest. The War and Peace itself does have a couple of connections to radical politics. The original book was supposed to be about the Decembrist uprising in Russia, which was a failed uprising, but you know, it's part of the chapters in revolutionary history in Russia. Yeah, if you're not familiar with the background, the background is that Leo Tolstoy started out trying to write a book about the Decembrist uprising, presumably because he himself was interested in radical politics. So he was sympathetic to the idealists of the Decembrists. But as he got more and more into the book, there was a backstory about how the characters, what had happened to the characters in the Napoleonic Wars, which had preceded the Decembrist uprising. And as Leo Tolstoy got more and more into this book, the backstory actually ended up becoming the main story. And the part about the Decembrists ended up just getting a very small epilogue at the end, which is kind of ambiguous and maybe like a dream sequence epilogue. And then like the bulk of the book became about the Napoleonic Wars. But still, I thought it was interesting that it had originated as something about revolutionary history. As well, the book was apparently partially influenced by a book of a similar name by Pierre-Joseph Proudhon, who was one of the fathers of French anarchism. So there's another connection there. In addition, I've always been a historical fiction buff. I love historical fiction. So I was curious to read about the history of the Napoleonic Wars with the War and Peace. And in fact, at my old place of work, there was a copy of War and Peace that was in the book exchange. There was a book exchange at my work. And I didn't read it at the time, but I used to, as you do, just kind of leaf through books and kind of check it out. And the very opening conversation, page 1 of War and Peace, which you'll be familiar with if you read the book, they're talking about a power grab that Napoleon has done in France and what the ramifications of this will be for Europe. This is two characters talking about politics here. Now, I guess there's a certain type of person that would scare away, but if you're a history buff like I am, or if you love historical fiction, you're like, this looks really interesting. Maybe this would be a fascinating book to read. Okay, so those are all the reasons why I really wanted to read this book, and why I decided to myself one day, okay, this is going to be the year when I read War and Peace. I want to read this book before I die. Now, having mentioned all those reasons why this book appeals to me, it's maybe worth noting that actually not all of those are good reasons to read the book. So, the radical politics, there's very little of that in this book. The pacifism, because Leo Tolstoy is a big pacifist, I thought this would be a huge anti-war book, but it's not really. We'll get to more of that later. The big epic war stuff. Yeah, it's in there, but it's not a major part of the book. There are sections that deal with the war, but by and far the vast majority of this book, and it is of course a big book. My edition was 1,441 pages. A vast majority of those pages are actually not dealing with the war. They're dealing with just the daily lives of these characters. Excuse me. So, yeah. Why would you read this book? Well, the best description I think I could give of this book, and I apologize in advance for making this comparison, but there's a Quentin Tarantino movie called Jackie Brown, which came out in the late 90s. And I'm old enough to remember when this came out, and it got pretty mixed reviews at the time. A lot of critics were not happy with it. And I saw an interview with Quentin Tarantino on the Charlie Rose show in which he was talking about the movie. And he said, a lot of critics have said that this movie is way too long or it's way too slow paced. He's like, I don't care if you like it or you hate it, but at least give me credit for this. I meant to do that. That was intentional. Said so often in movies, you don't get a chance to just hang out with the characters. To have scenes where there's nothing happening, you're just hanging out and enjoying the characters. He said that's what I was trying to do in this movie. Now, I saw that before I went to see the movie. I saw the movie in theaters the next week or something. And I really enjoyed that movie, but I enjoyed it in a large part, because I had been tipped off ahead of time that this was the mindset I had to be in when I watched the movie. I couldn't be impatient and be like, when is the action going to happen? When is the plot going to kick in? What's going on here? I knew that I was just supposed to enjoy hanging out with the characters, and once I knew that, I enjoyed the movie. Okay, so what does this have to do with War and Peace? You can probably guess where this is going. War and Peace is a book where you cannot be worried about the plot and cannot be like, where is the plot going? When are things going to start happening? You are there to hang out with the characters and just enjoy hanging out with them. And if you can get yourself in that mindset before you start reading this book, you're going to have a great time. But if you're not in that mindset, you're going to have a terrible time. Now, in my case, the translator's introduction, which was by Rosemary Edmonds, did a very good job of telling me what sort of ride I was in for and what kind of mood I needed to get myself in. And that helped me enjoy this book a lot. Quoting actually from the translator's introduction by Rosemary Edmonds, quote, Tolstoy never loses sight of his aim as an artist, which, as he said in a letter to a friend, is not to resolve a question irrefutably, but to compel one to love life in all its manifestations, and these are inexhaustible. If I were told that I could write a novel in which I could indisputably establish as true my point of view on all social questions, I would not dedicate 2 hours to such a work. But if I were told that what I write would be read 20 years from now by those who are children today, and that they would weep and laugh over it and fall in love with the life in it, then I would dedicate all my existence and all my powers to it. End quote. Now, maybe that sounds a little bit boring to you. If it sounds boring, the good news is that Tolstoy can actually create characters that you enjoy spending time with. This is obviously the kind of thing that would be very boring in the hands of a less skilled author, but Tolstoy pulls it off. The book is filled with characters who were so lifelike that I felt like they were either real people I knew or I strongly identified with them myself. Like, in other words, I said, this character is me. Like, that's exactly how I think. Or I said, okay, well, this character is not me, but I definitely know people like this in real life. You get an insight into the thought processes of the characters in this book. And as I was reading it, I thought, yes, that is so true. That is exactly how humans think. Even when characters were making bad choices, or even when a character was doing a bad thing, you could see into their thought process how they were justifying this action to themselves. And I thought, yeah, that's exactly how I try and justify stuff to myself as well, when I know I'm doing something that I shouldn't. None of the characters ever felt flat or realistic. None of them ever made choices that I thought were contrived. At every point, we understood exactly what they were doing when they were doing it. It really struck me when I was reading this book how much human nature does not change, or how unchanging human nature is. I mean, think about it. This is a book that was written over 100 years ago, describing people in a foreign country, culture, speaking a foreign language. And you read this and you think, wow, this is exactly just like me and my friends. And by the way, this is not just my opinion. I've had talks with other people who have read War and Peace. In the years since I've read the book, I've talked to a lot of people who have also read it and exchanged thoughts. And this seems to be a very common thing that people will say about this book. It's sometimes particularly interesting that this is a book about Russians, because Russians can sometimes have a bad reputation. Apologies to any Russians who are watching this. But in expat circles, like where I'm living right now in Cambodia or Vietnam, where there are a lot of Russian tourists or Russian expats who come through, people say, the Russians, they're harsh, they're not friendly, they're arrogant, but people have this bad image of the Russians. And I've said to those people, I said, read War and Peace, and you'll discover that Russians are exactly human, just like you and I are. I mean, the humanity coming out of this book is really real, and it makes you realize that Russians are not like these stern-faced, rude people that all the human characteristics that are in any culture are here. Sorry if that was a little bit patronizing to say, but it's worth noting. The other thing I really like about this book is that even though it's really long, it's all character focus. And I mention that because a lot of these huge books from the 19th century are not all focused on characters. I'm thinking maybe of people like Dostoevsky or Victor Hugo, who also 19th century writers who've written huge, thick books. Dostoevsky's case, he's got a tendency to kind of forget about his characters and just kind of get more into the philosophical issues that they're debating. Victor Hugo has a tendency to kind of go off on tangents describing the architecture or describing the structure of society or something like that, like these huge 50-page tangents. Tolstoy doesn't do that, well, at least not in War and Peace. At least not until the very end. Almost all of the book is completely just focused on spending time with these characters and describing the scenes and making you feel like you're there. You do not get these digressions to talk about what the architecture looked like or something like that. There is, I'll get to this later, there is 40 pages at the end where he does go on a digression about his view of historical forces. But again, this is a book that's 1,441 pages long, so maybe you can forgive 40 pages at the very end. And for what it's worth, I thought that digression was moderately interesting. I'll get to that later. Now, there's no getting around that this book is very long. So, you know, if you're intimidated by long books, this is a long book. But in my experience, in my opinion, if you just take your time with this book, you know, you're not rushed to finish it. It's not a race. Don't get impatient about the plot. Just let the book take its time. It's completely enjoyable. Now, in my case, I'm a slow reader. This took me 9 months to finish. And I had other little side books I was going on the side, you know. So like I would read something, I would read War and Peace a little bit in the afternoon, and then I would have a different book that I would read before bed, something that was a little bit lighter. And I think for someone like me, it helps to mix it up a little bit. So it's just not this book all the time. But I read a little bit of it every day, and I enjoyed it. And it was a pleasure to read at my own pace, which is what I would recommend doing. Now, the book covers the period of the Napoleonic Wars from 1805 to 1812. The brief epilogue at the end with the Decembrist revolt, but that epilogue is kind of murky and possibly a dream sequence. The book covers it's historical fiction, so it's got both real-life characters and fictional characters in it. Fictional characters are four aristocratic Russian families who are wealthy and relatively privileged, but are just kind of leading normal lives at the beginning of 1805. The very beginning of the book can be a little bit confusing, and again, this is one of those things that's not just my opinion. I've talked to other people who've read it, because there are four different families and all the different people in the families, and right at the beginning, it's hard to keep track of who's who, and it can panic people. They're like, oh no, all these names, all these families, I'm never going to be able to keep track of it. The edition I had a table telling you who was in what family, you know, those character tables that they usually have at the beginning of books or at the end. And I was referring to that frequently, but the good news is, as you keep reading, very soon it does become clear who's in what family, and then by the time you're about 50 or 100 pages into it, it's no problem. And again, this isn't just my opinion. I've talked to other people who have read the book, and this seems to be the common way people experience this book. I actually, just because I've got a certain type of personality, once I figured out who all the characters were and who's in what family, I went back and I started the book all over again. So I read the first 100 pages twice, which you don't need to do. That's me just being a little bit anal retentive. But I actually had a little bit of fun going back and rereading those opening pages now that I had a firm grasp of who was all in what family. So yeah, the main part of the book is the main part of the book is on the fictional characters. And even though there are these Napoleonic wars happening in the background, which occasionally do intrude onto the main part of the book, the vast majority of this book is not about the war. The vast majority is about the personal struggles of these characters as they try and find some sort of meaning in their life, and they try and find some sort of happiness in their life. And that's what the main bulk of the book is. That being said, if you're a history nerd like me, the historical sections are interesting. So let's talk about them. The book begins with Russia and Austria in an alliance against Napoleon. And there is some description about the military maneuverings and the generals, and I thought it was very interesting because there's this awkward chain of command because, you know, Russia and Austria they're allied together, right? So who is actually commanding the armies and who's controlling what? And they get into all this chain of command stuff, which reminded me of some of the histories you read of World War II and some of the awkward negotiations about who was in the chain of command with the Allied armies in World War II. Then as the history progresses, in 1807, Napoleon and the Russian emperor at the time, Alexander, make peace and divide Europe between them. But in 1812, the peace breaks down and Napoleon invades Russia and then captures Moscow. Now, if you know your history, you already know what's coming. The Russian army actually evacuates from Moscow. So when Napoleon's troops get there, there's nothing there. They take over Moscow. Moscow burns for reasons that nobody is really sure of. I think the most common historical explanation is that it was just an accident. Just because the city had been evacuated, there was nobody to stop the burning once a campfire got out of control or something. There are some conspiracy theories that it was intentionally burned down. Tolstoy, by the way, goes into this in his book. He is definitely of the opinion that it accidentally burned down, and this is just what happens to a city when it gets evacuated. Anyways, that's the real history. And I had read, prior to this, a few different books on Napoleon and these conflicts. So I knew that this was going to happen as I read this book, because most of the characters are based in Moscow. So I'm thinking, okay, the closer we get to 1812, closer we're going to get to the time when Moscow burns down. And I was so immersed in this world that Leo Tolstoy had created that even though I knew what was going to happen, even though I knew that Moscow was going to get burned down, I'm like, I can't possibly imagine it, because you're so immersed in this whole Moscow world and the world of these characters. It seems so surreal that anything could ever intrude on their world and kind of ruin their kind of tranquil family life here. Which, of course, when those scenes actually do happen, all the more emotional impact from when the characters have to evacuate Moscow and when Moscow does burn down. Okay, so that's the general history. There are several battle scenes in this book. And again, they're not the main chunk of the book. The main chunk is on domestic life. But they are there, and they are amazingly well written. Now, I didn't know much about Tolstoy's biography before I started reading this book. But as I was reading it, the battle scenes just seemed so realistic, or there was something so human in them that I thought, this has to be drawn from real life. He has to have some sort of battle experience. And sure enough, you look it up on Wikipedia, and he fought in the Crimean War. Tolstoy didn't actually fight in the Napoleonic Wars. He was writing about the generation just before his generation. So it was historical fiction even at the time he was writing it. But he did fight in the Crimean War, and that's where he based these battle scenes off of, his personal experience. Now, I was expecting, knowing that Tolstoy is a pacifist, I was expecting something like All Quiet on the Western Front, where you're constantly being hit over the head with war is bad, war is miserable, these soldiers are so miserable, everything's miserable. And it's not like that, actually. Despite the fact that Tolstoy was a pacifist, this book is not a polemical book about how bad war is. It's not specifically anti-war, nor is it pro-war. I mean, it doesn't really glorify the war or talk about heroes or stuff like that. Instead, what you get is a very human view of the war, kind of in all of its aspects. So, for example, you see that the soldiers are preparing for the battle. They know that many of them are not going to be there tomorrow, but they're doing everything they can not to think about it. There's the nervous joking that the soldiers do while they're under fire. There's the whole confusion of battle. I mean, it's not a book about brave, heroic men doing heroic things. It's about just men being confused in the battle, not being able to tell who the enemy is. There's a scene where a Frenchman and a Russian both grab each other, and then they're not sure who has taken who prisoner. Just all that confusion that happens in a real battle. There's another scene. This young man, he spends the whole battle being confused and really not knowing where he's going or where he's supposed to go. And then after the battle is over, he finds himself telling battle stories to his friends, in which his kind of confused running around ends up being a heroic charge. And the reason he converts that is not because he wants to come off as a hero, but just because he can't find any other way to process the confusing events that happened to him in a way that would make sense to anybody else. So he ends up just telling it like he was on a heroic charge. And all of those just seem very human. I was also impressed with the battle scenes, how the book does a good job of focusing on the individuals and what their individual experience is, but at the same time giving you a bird's eye view of what the larger battle is in a way that's very smoothly done. I suppose comparisons to the Iliad are cliche, but that particular aspect of it, I thought, reminded me a bit of the Iliad. The way the camera lens, so to speak, can go from the whole battle and then down to the individual. Now, the Iliad's all about heroes. This book is not about heroes, so there the comparison does break down, but to a certain extent. Also, I absolutely loved this description of army life. I've never been in the army. I don't know how true this is, but it just... Let me just read this. This is from the book, page 574 in the edition I had. Quote, "The Bible legend says that the absence of toil, idleness, was a circumstance of man's blessed state before the fall. Fallen man, too, has retained a love of idleness, but the curse still lies heavy on the human race, and not only because we have to earn our bread by the sweat of our brow, but because our moral statue is such that we are unable to be idle and at peace. A secret voice warns that for us, idleness is a sin. If it were possible for a man to discover a mode of existence in which he could feel that, though idle, he was of use to the world and fulfilling his duty, he would have attained to one facet of primeval bliss. And such a state of obligatory and unimpeachable idleness is enjoyed by a whole section of society, the military class. It is just this compulsory and irreproachable idleness which has always constituted and will constitute the chief attraction of military service. Now, despite not having any connection to the Army, I did feel like I could identify with that to the extent that I also, if I've got nothing to do, I feel bored. But if I'm at work, I don't want to do my work. So it would be nice to somehow feel like you're getting something productive done.